Right, so over the last 1 hour, we discussed about COVID-19, economic recovery and climate change. I want to take a moment to talk about Biden and the Indo-Pacific. How does he intend to deal with China? Now, these questions have engaged the attention of scholars worldwide. Now, I spoke to Nicola Smith, Asia correspondent of the Telegraph newspaper published from the UK, and I began by asking about Biden's China policy. Will Biden be as tough on China as Trump? And how will Biden's policy be different from Trump's? This is what she had to say.
I think it will be less confrontational than President Trump's strategy toward China. Although I don't think that President Biden is going to be soft per se on China. I think you can be tough, you can stand up to Beijing without being as confrontational or lashing out on different issues. And I don't think we're going to see a return to the Obama era, where there were criticisms that President Obama had been too soft on China, particularly on issues like the South China Sea, that he had not taken enough action to counter the spread of China's territorial claims there. And the past 4 years, in many ways, have been a wake-up call on China's foreign policies and its drive to expand. I think that many in Southeast Asia have appreciated Trump's willingness to call China out, and also the recognition by the Trump administration of the nature of the challenge with China. And I don't see President Biden and his administration pulling back from that. I think the style will be different, but I don't think that they are going to necessarily be soft on China, because so much has changed in the past 4 years. You've seen aggressive foreign policy from Beijing, particularly towards India, towards the border confrontation, threats against trade partners like Australia. You've seen the crackdown on Hong Kong, and also threats against Taiwan. We've had so many incursions by the People's Liberation Army, the Air Force, over the past few months, that it's going to be very hard for President Biden to not take a tougher stance towards China than he did when he was vice president.
Indeed. Just a quick follow-up question there, Nicola. You spoke about how Biden will not be soft on China, yet he could be less confrontational. Now, is that because that's his style? Is that his temperament? Or do you think domestic issues will leave him with very little time to focus on the foreign policy challenges obtaining in this part of the world?
I think it's going to be both, actually. I mean, he does have a very different style. He's much more of a traditional politician. He's a lifelong politician, whereas President Trump's whole brand was being an outsider and a very transactional businessman, which led to a more confrontational approach. So there is that. I don't think that President Biden does want to immediately get into conflicts with anyone on foreign policy. And obviously this year, his first challenge, and it's a huge one, is to deal with the pandemic and the fallout of the pandemic on the American economy, on health. America suffered a huge toll during the pandemic, and really people will be looking towards him to get the country back on track. And I don't think that he's going to necessarily neglect foreign policy, but he will have, his priority will be from day one to sort out America's huge problems just now. And he does have a good team to deal with foreign policy, and I'm sure he'll be relying a lot on them in the coming months.
Indeed. And looking at the Indo-Pacific from India's perspective for a moment, there are 4 countries that have come together in the Indo-Pacific region. That's India, the US, Japan, and Australia. And they are part of what is known as the quadrilateral, or the Quad. Now, what kind of a future do you anticipate for the Quad under President Biden?
I think that there will be, again, more collaboration with America, and perhaps an expectation on the countries of the Quad to take more of a role in the Indo-Pacific. They're all closer and based in the region. So I think there will be an expectation from Washington that India takes more of a role, and also Australia and Japan, in terms of countering China's influence in the region, and also the authoritarian ideology that China brings to the table. So I mean, it's definitely significant that the Quad has started to revive its activities after a hiatus, and I think that's a reflection of the nature of the challenge that China is posing currently regionally. And I do see more collaboration coming up on the military and diplomatic front over the next few months. I think one of the challenges for the Quad and for other regional allies is to bring some kind of alternative in terms of economic diplomacy, especially as the region recovers from the pandemic, and even countries in Asia who have not suffered terribly on the health front have still taken a real blow economically. And if you're looking at the Pacific Islands and Pacific nations who have been quite sheltered from COVID-19, they are going to struggle, and there's going to be economically, and there's going to be a battle for influence that will take place in the economic sphere as well as the military and diplomatic sphere. So that is a role that the Quad should be looking at. It's difficult to know really how the Quad is going to handle that, because there are strategic differences between the countries, but it's certainly something they should be talking about.
Indeed. Now, you live and work in Taiwan. Now, how would issues such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, or even Xinjiang, how will they fare going forward, especially under a Biden in the White House?
It is going to be one of Biden's biggest foreign policy challenges, how he handles these human rights issues and China. We've already seen an early indication on Hong Kong when there were mass arrests last week of pro-democracy activists and politicians, and Antony Blinken, who is his nominee for Secretary of State, made quite a strong statement on Twitter and saying that America would stand by the people of Hong Kong and against China's attempts to crack down on democracy. So I think that's an early signal that Biden isn't going to turn the other way when it comes to human rights abuses that are perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. There's on Xinjiang, there's more and more evidence coming to light of alleged atrocities that are taking place there. And that again is going to be a challenge to Biden as to how he handles that and maintains a cooperative relationship with China. When it comes to Taiwan, the stakes are very high, not only for Taiwan, but also for America and for China. Taiwan is very strategic. It's in a very strategic location. It's part of the first island chain. China currently doesn't have a Pacific coastline. If it ends up taking over Taiwan, then it would have a Pacific coastline, which would have huge implications for the US. And also Taiwan's position in terms of strategic waterways and trade routes, and just its status as a democracy in a region that is quite turbulent, and it really does have a kind of special link with the US in that sense. I don't see Biden pulling back from defending Taiwan or supporting Taiwan. I think he does have to clarify his strategy very quickly, especially as the outgoing Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has just changed the terms of how US and Taiwanese officials interact with each other, lifting previous restrictions. So that that puts the Biden administration in the position where they have to set out very quickly how they will interpret those changes, which are very sensitive in Beijing.
And finally, Nicola, you report on Chinese affairs as well for your newspaper. Now, if I were to ask you, how would Beijing be looking at the Biden presidency, and how do you look at the Xi Jinping-Biden dynamic going forward?
It's very hard to put your mind into the minds of another government, especially a communist government. I would imagine that they would see an opportunity with Biden to reset relations. I imagine they would expect him to be a bit softer and less transactional than President Trump. I mean, I think Beijing is just going to be like the rest of the world, watching very carefully in the first few months for signs of how hawkish or how dovish the Biden administration will be towards China. And there's a lot of unanswered questions, not only in Beijing but also in Taiwan as well, who are watching. They're watching very closely also.
Right. On that note, Nicola Smith in Taiwan, thank you so much for joining us on DD India. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.